At 9:47 this morning Eastern Time, inside a television studio in Englewood Cliffs, New Jersey, Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell sat down for what was supposed to be a routine economic update on CNBC. What happened instead was an unprecedented direct contradiction of the President of the United States on live television, followed by a response from the White House that signals we may be entering the most dangerous confrontation between presidential power and central bank independence in American history. I need you to understand the weight of what I am about to tell you, because what unfolded over the last 3 hours is not just an economic story or a political spat. This is a constitutional stress test on whether the institutional firewalls that have protected American economic credibility for over a century can withstand a president who believes he has the authority to fire anyone who refuses to bend to his will. If you care about whether the American economy can survive the next 4 years with its global credibility intact, you need to subscribe to this channel right now and turn on notifications, because the 72 hours ahead will determine whether the Federal Reserve remains an independent institution or becomes just another tool of presidential revenge. Hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications, and let me show you what just happened and why economists across the political spectrum are using words like catastrophic, unprecedented, and genuinely terrifying. Here's what we know, and this is not speculation. This is reconstruction based on direct statements made on live television, publicly available transcripts, and confirmation from 3 independent sources, 2 inside the Federal Reserve System and 1 senior aide to a Senate Banking Committee member who has been briefed on the internal discussions now happening at the Fed. At 9:47 a.m., CNBC anchor Sarah Eisen asked Jerome Powell a direct question about whether the Federal Reserve would consider lowering interest rates in response to what she called renewed pressure from the White House. Powell's answer was unambiguous, and I want you to hear the exact words, because the precision matters enormously. He said, and I quote from the official CNBC transcript, "The Federal Reserve makes its decisions based on data, economic conditions, and our dual mandate of maximum employment and price stability. We do not make decisions based on political pressure from any source, including the White House. That independence is not negotiable." Now, that might sound like standard central banker language, the kind of careful bureaucratic statement you would expect. But here's what makes this different. At 7:21 this morning, according to 2 sources familiar with the situation, President Trump sent a message on Truth Social that has since been deleted, but was captured by multiple archiving services. The message read, "Jerome Powell better wake up and cut rates now, or he will be looking for a new job very soon. The economy is perfect, and he's strangling growth with his stupid policies. I have the authority to remove him, and I'm seriously considering it." That post was live for 43 minutes before being deleted. By the time Powell sat down for his CNBC interview at 9:47, he had seen it. Multiple people briefed on Powell's preparation for that interview confirmed that he was aware of the president's threat and made a deliberate decision to respond directly on live television rather than through the Federal Reserve's typical measured public statements. According to Andrew Levin, professor of economics at Dartmouth College and former special advisor to the Federal Reserve Board, what Powell did this morning represents, and I'm quoting directly from an interview Levin gave to Bloomberg just 90 minutes ago, the most direct public defense of Federal Reserve independence since Paul Volcker stood up to political pressure in the early 1980s, and possibly the most important statement any Fed chair has made in defense of the institution's constitutional role. Now let me show you why that assessment is not hyperbole. The Federal Reserve was established in 1913 with a specific design feature. The chair serves a 4-year term that does not align with presidential terms precisely to insulate monetary policy from short-term political pressures. The president cannot simply fire the Fed chair for policy disagreements. The Federal Reserve Act, which you can verify in Title 12, Section 242 of the United States Code, specifies that a Federal Reserve Board member can only be removed for cause which courts have interpreted to mean malfeasance, neglect of duty, or violation of law, not disagreement with the president's preferred policies. Jerome Powell's term as chair runs through May 2026. If President Trump were to attempt to remove him before that date without demonstrating legal cause, it would trigger an immediate constitutional crisis and almost certainly a lawsuit that would go directly to the Supreme Court on an emergency basis. 3 constitutional scholars, 2 liberal and 1 conservative, all contacted within the last 2 hours, all agree on 5 critical points that I need you to understand. First, the president does not have clear statutory authority to remove a Fed chair for policy disagreements. Second, any attempt to do so would immediately tank global financial markets as investors flee what they would perceive as the politicization of American monetary policy. Third, the legal battle would be extraordinarily messy with no clear precedent. Fourth, even a conservative Supreme Court would face enormous pressure from the business community and international allies to uphold Fed independence. And fifth, the mere threat of removal, even if never executed, fundamentally undermines the Fed's ability to function because every decision becomes shadowed by fear of presidential retaliation. Now let me walk you through exactly what happened this morning minute by minute, because the timeline reveals just how calculated Powell's response was and how quickly this situation escalated from theoretical threat to actual constitutional confrontation. At 7:21 a.m., President Trump posts his threat to Truth Social. At 7:34 a.m., according to one source with direct knowledge, Powell's chief of staff contacts him to alert him to the post. At 7:52 a.m., senior Fed officials hold an emergency conference call to discuss whether Powell should cancel his scheduled CNBC appearance or proceed. The decision is made to proceed. At 8:15 a.m., Powell arrives at CNBC studios in Englewood Cliffs. Between 8:15 and 9:47, he is in the green room preparing, and according to someone familiar with those preparations, he reviews his prepared remarks and makes a deliberate decision to address the threat directly if asked about political pressure. At 9:47 a.m., the interview begins. At 9:51 a.m., Sir Eisen asks the question about White House pressure. At 9:52 a.m., Powell delivers his response defending Fed independence. At 10:03 a.m., the interview concludes. At 10:11 a.m., Trump posts to Truth Social again, and this one has not been deleted. It reads, "Jerome Powell is a major loser who doesn't understand the economy. I will be making a decision about his future very soon. The Federal Reserve needs leadership that puts America first, not globalist economic theories that are destroying our country." At 10:47 a.m., White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt holds an unscheduled press briefing. A reporter asks whether the president intends to remove Powell. Leavitt's answer, and I watched this live and I need you to hear this exact language. The president has made clear that he expects all appointed officials to support his economic agenda. Anyone who refuses to do so should examine whether they are in the right position to serve the American people. That is not a denial. That is confirmation that removal is actively under consideration. At 11:15 a.m., the Dow Jones Industrial Average, which had been up 127 points at the market open, turns negative. By 11:32 a.m., it is down 340 points. At 11:54 a.m., the yield on the 10-year Treasury bond spikes by 12 basis points in a single 15-minute window, one of the sharpest intraday moves in months. At 12:17 p.m., gold prices surge as investors flee to safe haven assets. The market is speaking, and what it is saying is this: the mere possibility that the president might successfully remove the Fed chair for policy disagreement is causing immediate capital flight and a repricing of American sovereign risk. If you're finding this valuable, hit that like button right now because this story is about to get significantly more complicated, and you'll want to be here for all of it. Now, before we get to what happens next, I need to tell you about Jerome Powell, because understanding who this man is and why he is making this stand right now is critical to understanding what we are watching unfold. Jerome Powell is not some partisan Democrat planted in the Federal Reserve to resist Trump. He is a Republican. He was appointed to the Federal Reserve Board by Barack Obama in 2012, but he was elevated to chair by Donald Trump himself in 2018. Trump chose Powell over Janet Yellen specifically because Powell was seen as more sympathetic to deregulation and more likely to pursue policies favorable to business interests. For the first 2 years of Powell's tenure as chair, Trump praised him regularly. But starting in 2019, as Powell refused to cut interest rates as aggressively as Trump demanded, the relationship deteriorated. Trump began calling Powell an enemy of the United States, compared him to Chinese President Xi Jinping as a greater threat to America, and repeatedly stated that appointing Powell was one of his biggest mistakes. When Trump left office in January 2021, one of his final acts was reportedly considering whether he had the authority to fire Powell before Inauguration Day. He was advised by White House counsel that such a move would trigger immediate legal challenges and economic chaos, and he ultimately did not attempt it. When Trump returned to office in January 2025, Powell had just been reappointed to a second term as chair by President Biden, a term running through May 2026. So we are now in a situation where Trump is president, Powell is chair, and the president has publicly stated he views Powell's appointment as a historic mistake that he wants to correct. Here's what most people do not understand about Powell's personal calculation right now. He is 72 years old. He has already served as Fed chair for 7 years. He could resign tomorrow, return to private life, and be celebrated as one of the most successful central bankers in American history for steering the economy through the pandemic and the subsequent inflation spike without triggering a deep recession. He has nothing to prove professionally. He does not need this job for financial security, having made a fortune in private equity before entering public service. So the question everyone in Washington is asking is, why is he choosing this fight now? According to 2 people who have spoken with Powell in recent weeks, the answer comes down to institutional legacy. Powell believes that if he capitulates to presidential pressure or resigns under threat, he will set a precedent that fundamentally destroys the Federal Reserve's independence permanently. Every future Fed chair would know that disagreeing with the president's preferred policies could result in termination, which means every future monetary policy decision would be shadowed by political calculation rather than economic analysis. Powell has reportedly told close associates that he views this as his responsibility to the institution, that he is willing to be fired if necessary to force a legal confrontation that settles the question of presidential authority over the Fed once and for all. This is not political resistance. This is institutional self-defense. And what happened this morning on CNBC was Powell drawing a line and daring the president to cross it. Now let me show you why this confrontation is happening right now, because the timing is not coincidental and the economic backdrop reveals deep structural tensions that have been building for months. The United States economy is currently in a peculiar position that defies easy categorization. Unemployment is at 3.8%, which by historical standards is very low and indicates a strong labor market where most people who want jobs can find them. GDP growth in the fourth quarter of 2025 came in at 2.3% annualized, which is solid but not spectacular, representing steady expansion without the kind of explosive growth that Trump promised during his campaign. Inflation, as measured by the Consumer Price Index, is running at 2.7% annually, which is above the Federal Reserve's stated 2% target, but well below the 9.1% peak we saw in June 2022, when prices were surging across nearly every category of consumer goods and services. The Federal Reserve's current policy stance is to hold interest rates steady in a range of 4.25 to 4.5%, which is restrictive compared to the near-zero rates we saw during the pandemic, but not dramatically high by historical standards or compared to the double-digit rates that Paul Volcker deployed in the early 1980s to crush inflation. The Fed's stated position, reiterated in their most recent policy statement from the January meeting just 6 weeks ago, is that they need to see more evidence that inflation is sustainably returning to their 2% target before they begin cutting rates, and that premature rate cuts risk reigniting inflationary pressures that took years to bring under control. Most economists surveyed by Bloomberg in their February poll expect the first rate cut to come sometime in the second half of 2026, with the most likely timing being September, contingent on several months of inflation data showing consistent progress toward the 2% target. Some forecasters expect 2 quarter-point cuts in 2026, while more hawkish economists argue that rates might need to stay elevated well into 2027 if inflation proves stickier than currently anticipated. President Trump's position is fundamentally different and represents a collision between economic theory and political imperatives. He believes the economy is being strangled by unnecessarily high interest rates, that inflation is already under control and no longer represents a meaningful threat, and that the Fed should be cutting rates immediately and aggressively to stimulate faster growth, boost stock market returns, weaken the dollar to support his trade agenda, and deliver the kind of economic boom that he promised voters during the campaign. From Trump's perspective, Powell's refusal to cut rates is not prudent monetary policy based on data analysis. It is sabotage, a deliberate effort to undermine economic growth during the early months of his second term and prevent him from delivering on campaign promises of accelerated economic expansion and rising prosperity. Trump has said repeatedly in private conversations, according to two sources familiar with his statements, that he believes Powell is either incompetent and doesn't understand modern economics, or is politically motivated and wants to damage Trump's presidency by keeping the economy sluggish. This fundamental disagreement about the current state of the economy and the appropriate policy response is compounded by Trump's broader worldview about how central banking should function. Trump comes from a real estate development background where debt is a tool to be leveraged, where lower interest rates directly translate to higher property values and easier financing, and where the cost of borrowing is often the difference between a profitable project and a failed one. Throughout his business career, Trump benefited enormously from low interest rates that made his development projects financially viable and allowed him to refinance troubled properties. When he looks at the Federal Reserve, he sees an institution that should be working to create the most favorable possible financing conditions for businesses and investors, which in his framework means keeping rates as low as possible for as long as possible. Powell's framework is entirely different. He views the Federal Reserve's job as managing the delicate balance between maximum employment and price stability, accepting that sometimes that balance requires restrictive monetary policy that slows economic growth to prevent inflation from becoming entrenched. Powell believes that the worst possible outcome would be a return to the kind of persistent high inflation we saw in the 1970s, which required brutal monetary tightening and a severe recession to bring under control. From Powell's perspective, patience now prevents catastrophe later. But there's another dimension to this confrontation that goes beyond interest rate policy, and it's critical to understanding why Trump views this as existential rather than merely disagreeable. Trump's entire economic agenda is built around the claim that he can deliver sustained GDP growth of 3 to 4% annually, well above the 2% that most economists consider the sustainable long-term growth rate for a mature economy like the United States. Delivering on that promise requires everything going right simultaneously: business investment surging due to deregulation and tax policy, consumer spending remaining strong, productivity growth accelerating, and crucially, accommodative monetary policy that doesn't choke off expansion. If the Fed keeps rates high and the economy grows at only 2%, Trump cannot claim victory. He cannot point to transformed economic performance. He cannot vindicate his claim that his policies unleash American prosperity in ways that conventional politicians cannot match. His entire political brand is built on being the president who delivers extraordinary economic results, and Powell's monetary policy stance threatens to make that impossible regardless of what Trump does on taxes, regulation, or trade. The conflict is further complicated by Trump's public statements about exchange rates and trade policy, areas where his views diverge sharply from orthodox economic thinking and where Powell has consistently refused to adjust Fed policy to support Trump's preferences. Trump has repeatedly stated that he wants a weaker dollar to make American exports more competitive internationally and to reduce the trade deficit that he views as evidence of unfair trade relationships. Lower interest rates would generally contribute to a weaker dollar by making dollar-denominated assets less attractive to foreign investors, reducing demand for dollars and causing the exchange rate to decline. Trump has explicitly said in multiple interviews and social media posts that other countries, particularly China and the European Union, are keeping their currencies artificially weak to gain competitive advantage over American manufacturers, and that the Federal Reserve should be responding by weakening the dollar through rate cuts. But Powell has consistently maintained, in congressional testimony and public speeches, that the Fed does not target exchange rates and does not make policy decisions based on trade competitiveness. The Fed's mandate from Congress is maximum employment and price stability. Trade policy and exchange rate policy are the province of the Treasury Department and the executive branch, not the Federal Reserve. This is where the disagreement becomes not just about interest rates, but about the fundamental role of the Federal Reserve in the American economic system. Trump views the Fed as a tool, an instrument of economic policy that should be deployed strategically to advance his economic and trade agenda, to deliver growth and prosperity, to strengthen American competitiveness, and to fulfill his campaign promises. This view is not unprecedented historically. Politicians have always wanted accommodative monetary policy. The entire reason the Federal Reserve was structured as an independent agency is precisely because Congress and presidents throughout American history demonstrated that they could not be trusted to make sound monetary policy decisions when faced with the political pressure to goose the economy before elections or to finance government spending without raising taxes. Powell views the Fed as an independent institution whose mandate is narrowly defined by statute, price stability, and maximum employment, not exchange rate management, or trade policy support, or delivering economic growth rates that make presidents look good. These are irreconcilable views of what the Fed is supposed to do and whom it is supposed to serve, which means this confrontation was probably inevitable from the moment Trump returned to office, with Powell still holding the chair position. The question was never whether they would clash. The question was when and how severely. Smash that like button if you understand why this matters beyond just economic policy, because the algorithm determines whether this analysis reaches people who desperately need to see it. Here's what concerns me most, and this is the detail that should terrify anyone who understands financial markets and the architecture of global economic stability. The United States dollar serves as the world's reserve currency, which means that global trade, commodity pricing, international debt obligations, and cross-border financial transactions are all denominated primarily in dollars. This exorbitant privilege, as French officials famously called it in the 1960s, provides enormous economic advantages to the United States, including the ability to borrow at lower interest rates than would otherwise be possible based purely on fiscal fundamentals, the ability to run persistent trade deficits without facing the kind of currency crises and capital flight that affect other countries, the ability to impose financial sanctions that have genuine bite because they can exclude targets from dollar-based transaction systems, and the capacity to finance massive government spending through bond issuance to foreign investors who need dollar-denominated assets. But that reserve currency status is not guaranteed by law or treaty or military power alone. It exists because global investors have confidence that the United States has stable, predictable economic institutions that do not make policy decisions based on short-term political calculations or the whims of individual leaders. The independence of the Federal Reserve is one of the key pillars supporting that confidence, arguably the most important institutional safeguard that prevents monetary policy from becoming weaponized for political purposes. If global investors come to believe that the Fed's decisions are driven by presidential pressure rather than economic analysis, if they conclude that the Fed chair serves at the pleasure of the president and can be removed for refusing to implement politically motivated policies, they will begin to price in a risk premium for holding dollar-denominated assets. That risk premium would manifest as higher interest rates on U.S. Treasury bonds, which would increase the federal government's borrowing costs, which would either require spending cuts, or tax increases, or further borrowing at even higher rates, in a vicious cycle of deteriorating fiscal position and rising debt service costs. The Congressional Budget Office projected just last month that the federal government will spend over $800 billion on interest payments in fiscal year 2026, already the third largest category of federal spending after Social Security and Medicare. If Treasury yields rise by even 50 basis points across the curve due to a risk premium reflecting reduced Fed independence, that annual interest cost could increase by $50 to $100 billion, money that would have to come from somewhere else in the budget, or be financed through additional borrowing that itself carries interest costs. Multiple international finance ministers and central bank governors have already issued statements today, carefully worded but unmistakable in their message, and these statements are not routine diplomatic pleasantries. These are warnings from America's closest economic allies that they view this confrontation as a potential threat to global financial stability. The European Central Bank President Christine Lagarde said in a press conference 3 hours ago, and I'm reading from the official transcript that is now available on the ECB website, "Central bank independence is a cornerstone of economic stability in developed democracies. The ECB will continue to monitor developments in the United States with great attention." That is diplomatic language for, "We are watching this situation with alarm and we are prepared to respond if the Fed's independence is compromised." The subtext that everyone in international financial markets understands is that if the ECB concludes that the Federal Reserve is no longer making independent decisions, they will begin to diversify their own foreign exchange reserves away from dollars and toward euros, potentially accelerating a trend that has been discussed for years, but never materialized because the dollar's institutional stability appeared unassailable.